the mysterious beginning of Elijah the prophet. What makes a prophet unforgettable? Is it the miracles they perform, the messages they deliver, or the legacy they leave behind? For Elijah, one of the most enigmatic figures in the Bible, it might just be all three. But before we dive into his incredible deeds, calling fire from heaven, confronting kings, and even being swept into the skies, let's stop and ask, who was this man, and where did he come from? Elijah's story begins shrouded in mystery. He is introduced abruptly in 1 Kings 17 verse 1, described simply as Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead. But here's the thing, the Bible doesn't tell us much about his early life. We don't know his family, his upbringing, or what drove him to become a prophet. Gilead, his homeland, was a rugged, mountainous region, known for its wilderness and tough terrain. Could it be that this harsh environment shaped Elijah's fearless character? Imagine a young Elijah roaming the rocky hills of Gilead, growing up surrounded by the raw beauty of nature, the howling winds, the star-filled skies, and the solitude of the wilderness could have been where he first felt the presence of God. Perhaps this is where his fiery faith began to burn. A faith so strong that it would later allow him to stand alone against a nation of idol worshippers. But here's a deeper question. Why Elijah? Of all the people in Israel, why did God choose this man to carry one of the most significant prophetic missions of all time? To understand this, we need to zoom out and look at the state of Israel during Elijah's time. The nation was in spiritual chaos. King Ahab, alongside his infamous wife Jezebel, had led the people into the worship of Baal, a false god associated with fertility and storms. The worship of Baal wasn't just a religious mistake. It was a direct rejection of the God who had delivered Israel from slavery, guided them through the wilderness, and given them the promised land. Israel was in desperate need of a prophet, not just to deliver God's message but to ignite a spiritual awakening. Enter Elijah, whose very name means, "My God is Yahweh." His name wasn't just a label, it was his mission statement. Elijah was born for confrontation, for revival, and for reminding Israel of the one true God. Here's something fascinating. The prophet Malachi, in the last book of the Old Testament, foretells Elijah's return. Malachi 4 verse 5 says, "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." Why does Elijah's name echo through time? Could it be that his life holds keys not just for his generation but for ours as well? And here's a thought to ponder. Elijah's sudden appearance mirrors his abrupt departure. He enters the biblical narrative with no introduction and leaves it in a whirlwind of fire. Is this a coincidence or part of a divine design? Stay with us as we journey deeper into the life of Elijah, the prophet of fire and faith. His story is not just about the past. It's a call to courage, conviction, and the power of standing for what's right, even when the odds are against you. Elijah's origins may be veiled in mystery, but his impact is as clear as the fire he called down from heaven. Are you ready to uncover the secrets of this extraordinary prophet? Let's find out. Elijah's first miracles. Signs of a prophet's power and faith. What's the mark of a true prophet? Is it the words they speak or the wonders they perform? In Elijah's case, the answer is both. From the very beginning of his ministry, Elijah didn't just proclaim God's power. He demonstrated it in ways that left no room for doubt. But these miracles weren't mere displays of divine might. Each one carried a message, a lesson, and a glimpse of a God who provides, sustains, and restores even in the darkest times. It all started with a bold proclamation. Imagine the scene. Elijah strides into the court of King Ahab, a ruler infamous for his idolatry and alliance with Jezebel, and declares, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." 1 Kings 17 verse 1. The audacity of this statement is staggering. In an agrarian society, rain meant life, prosperity, and survival. To challenge Baal, the supposed god of storms, with a drought was nothing short of a direct confrontation with Israel's false worship. But here's the twist. God didn't just send Elijah to deliver the message. He sent him into hiding. Why? Perhaps to prepare him, to sustain him, and to show that even in isolation, God's provision never fails. The brook Cherith, a lesson in dependence. Elijah fled to the brook Cherith, a secluded stream east of the Jordan. Picture him there, alone in the wilderness, with nothing but the sound of water and the rustle of leaves. How would he survive? God had a plan. Ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and evening. Think about that. Ravens, scavenger birds, delivering sustenance to God's prophet. It's a miracle that defies nature itself. A reminder that God's provision often comes from the most unexpected sources. But then the brook dried up. Imagine Elijah watching as the last trickle of water disappeared into the parched earth. Was this the end? Or was it another step in a journey of faith? The widow of Zarephath, a miracle of sustenance. God sent Elijah to Zarephath, a Gentile town outside of Israel's borders, to a widow on the brink of starvation. When Elijah met her, she was gathering sticks to prepare her final meal, a meager handful of flour and a little oil, for herself and her son. Elijah's request must have sounded absurd. First, make me a small loaf of bread and bring it to me. Then, make something for yourself and your son. 1 Kings 17 verse 13. Can you imagine her hesitation? Yet, in an act of remarkable faith, she obeyed. And here's the miracle. The jar of flour didn't run out, and the jug of oil never went dry. Day after day, God provided enough to sustain them through the famine. This wasn't just a miracle of provision. It was a message of trust. When we place God first, even in our scarcity, He meets our needs in ways we cannot comprehend. Resurrection, the God who restores life. But Elijah's miracles didn't stop at provision. They escalated into something even more extraordinary. One day, the widow's son fell ill and died. Her grief was overwhelming. Had she invited the prophet into her home only to experience greater loss? Elijah took the boy in his arms, carried him to the upper room, and cried out to God, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." 1 Kings 17 verse 21. Stretching himself over the child 3 times, Elijah prayed with unwavering faith. And then it happened, the boy's life returned. He was alive again. This was the first recorded resurrection in the Bible, a powerful foreshadowing of the ultimate restoration God would bring through Jesus Christ. It was a miracle that not only proved God's power over life and death, but also revealed His deep compassion for the brokenhearted. Prophet who walked by faith. Elijah's early miracles weren't just acts of divine intervention. They were stepping stones in a journey of faith. They revealed a God who provides in the wilderness, sustains through scarcity, and restores life when all seems lost. But they also pointed to the growing faith of Elijah himself, a man who relied on God's word even when it defied logic or seemed impossible. What about us? When we face droughts in our own lives, moments of lack, despair, or uncertainty, do we trust in the God who sends ravens, multiplies flour, and breathes life into the lifeless? Elijah's first miracles invite us to step into a deeper faith, to believe in the God who is always present, always faithful, and always enough. But Elijah's journey was just beginning. These miracles were only the prelude to one of the most dramatic showdowns in biblical history, a confrontation that would shake a nation and prove once and for all who the true God is. Are you ready to witness the fire from heaven? Stay with us. The story of Elijah is far from over. The battle on Mount Carmel, the prophet's showdown with Baal. Imagine a scene where the entire nation gathers at the foot of a mountain, the air thick with tension, the stakes higher than ever. At the top stands Elijah, the prophet of Israel, alone, facing an army of 450 prophets of Baal. It was the ultimate test, a showdown that would decide the fate of an entire nation. But what was this battle really about? Was it just about a contest of power? Or was it about something much deeper, the question of who truly reigns over Israel and over our hearts? This was no ordinary confrontation. It was the battle for the soul of Israel. King Ahab, under the influence of his wife Jezebel, had led Israel into the worship of Baal, the Canaanite god of storms and fertility. But now, God was about to make a statement that would echo through history. He wasn't just going to challenge Baal's prophets. He was going to silence the false gods and reveal to the world once and for all who was the true God. The challenge: who will answer by fire? Elijah, standing alone against hundreds of false prophets, asked a piercing question. How long will you waver between two opinions? 1 Kings 18 verse 21. The people of Israel had been straddling the fence, torn between worshiping the one true God and bowing to the idols of Baal. Elijah's words cut deep. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Then came the challenge. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, but only one answer. The prophets of Baal would call on their God to send fire to consume their sacrifice, and Elijah would do the same. The God who answered by fire would be the true God, the one worthy of Israel's worship. The prophets of Baal, a cry to a silent God. The scene that followed was nothing short of dramatic. The 450 prophets of Baal began their frantic rituals, dancing around their altar, calling out to Baal from morning until noon, shouting, "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice, no answer. Elijah, standing at the sidelines, couldn't help but taunt them. "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." 1 Kings 18 verse 27. The mockery cut through the air as Baal's prophets grew desperate. They slashed themselves with swords and spears, trying to provoke their god to act. But still, there was no answer. It was the silence of defeat, a silence that spoke volumes. Baal was powerless, just a god made of stone, a god who couldn't hear or save. Elijah's moment of faith, the altar of the Lord. Now the stage was set for Elijah's turn. He stepped forward, but his actions were nothing like the frantic display of the prophets of Baal. Elijah wasn't desperate. He was confident in the God he served. First, he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down during the years of Baal worship. He used 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, symbolizing the covenant God had made with his people. Then, Elijah did something that would seem crazy in the midst of a drought. He ordered water to be poured over the altar, for large jars 3 times. Why? Because he wanted to make it clear that there would be no natural explanation for the miracle that was about to unfold. With the altar drenched and the trench around it filled with water, Elijah prayed a simple but powerful prayer. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." 1 Kings 18 verse 36. The answer: fire from heaven. And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. The fire was so fierce, so consuming, that the people fell to their knees, crying out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" 1 Kings 18 verse 39. This wasn't just a fire from the sky. This was a moment that demonstrated God's absolute sovereignty. In the face of all the idolatry and deception, God made himself known in a way that could not be ignored. There was no mistaking it. Yahweh was the true God, and Baal was nothing but a lie. The turning point: a nation awakened. But the victory didn't end with the fire. Elijah took action. He ordered the false prophets of Baal to be seized and executed at the Kishon Valley. It was a decisive moment, a moment of judgment upon those who had led Israel astray. The people who had once wavered between 2 gods now saw with their own eyes the power of the one true God. The hearts of the people were turned back to the Lord. This moment on Mount Carmel was a turning point in Israel's history, but it also carries a timeless lesson. How often do we, like the Israelites, waver between competing gods in our own lives? The gods of success, pleasure, power, and self-sufficiency may not be as obvious as Baal, but they often demand our allegiance. And yet, when we choose the one true God, He reveals His power in ways that leave no room for doubt. The fire that burns today. Elijah's showdown on Mount Carmel isn't just a story of the past. It's a call to every generation to choose whom they will serve. When we stand on the side of the true God, His fire will burn brightly in our hearts, consuming all the false idols and filling us with His presence. Are you ready to make the choice? Are you ready for God to reveal himself to you in powerful, undeniable ways? Stay tuned, for the story of Elijah is far from over. What happens next will shake you to the core. Elijah's flight and despair. A prophet on the run. After the monumental victory on Mount Carmel, you might think Elijah would have felt invincible, standing tall as the hero of Israel. But the reality of his situation was far different. Despite witnessing the incredible power of God, Elijah found himself running for his life, overwhelmed by fear, exhaustion, and despair. What could possibly drive a man who had just called down fire from heaven to flee into the wilderness? How could a prophet who had just triumphed over 450 false prophets now be paralyzed by fear? The answer begins with one word: Jezebel. The threat of Jezebel. Queen Jezebel, furious at the execution of her prophets and the public humiliation of her god, Baal, sent a messenger to Elijah with a chilling message. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. 1 Kings 19 verse 2. It was a death sentence. In an instant, Elijah's confidence evaporated. How could he, the prophet who had just stood boldly before a nation, now be brought to the brink of despair by the mere words of one woman? The fear of death became all-consuming, and in the face of such a personal threat, Elijah ran. The flight into the wilderness. Without hesitation, Elijah fled for his life. He didn't just run for a few miles, he ran for days. He traveled through the desert, heading towards Beersheba in Judah, a place far from the dangers of Jezebel's reach. But running physically didn't quiet the storm inside his heart. Elijah was weary, not just from his flight, but from the constant battle against idolatry, the weight of his calling, and the overwhelming sense of isolation. When he arrived in Beersheba, he left his servant behind and journeyed even further into the wilderness, seeking refuge in solitude. It's almost as if he wanted to disappear, to escape not only from his enemies but from his own sense of failure. The prophet's prayer, a cry for death. And then, in the midst of the barren desert, Elijah did something heartbreaking. He prayed for death. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. 1 Kings 19 verse 4. Here was a man who had faced giants, stood against kings, and commanded fire from heaven. Yet now, in his deepest moment of despair, Elijah felt like a failure. He was exhausted, both physically and spiritually. He couldn't see the end of his struggles, and the weight of his mission had driven him to the edge. Have you ever felt like Elijah? Overwhelmed by the trials in your life, wondering if it's even worth going on? Have the burdens of your responsibilities, the constant challenges, or the loneliness of your journey made you question if you're enough? Elijah's story speaks to the depths of human emotion. Even the most faithful servants of God can reach their breaking point. The compassionate response of God. But here's the turning point in Elijah's journey. The moment where God's response to Elijah's despair reveals something profound about his character. Instead of rebuking Elijah, God showed him compassion. He didn't reprimand Elijah for his fear or his despair. Instead, he provided for him. An angel appeared to Elijah, not with condemnation, but with care. The angel gave Elijah food and water, allowing him to rest. Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. 1 Kings 19 verse 7. God knew the exhaustion Elijah was experiencing, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, and he provided the sustenance Elijah needed to continue. This wasn't just about physical nourishment. It was a message of grace. God met Elijah in his lowest moment, not with demands or judgments, but with comfort and encouragement. God knew that Elijah couldn't continue the journey on his own. He needed divine strength to carry on. Strength for the journey ahead. Elijah ate the food and drank the water, and in the strength of that divine provision, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. This was no ordinary journey. It was a pilgrimage to a place where Elijah would meet with God in a profound way, a place of spiritual renewal, where the prophet would discover that even in his darkest hour, he was not alone. The journey to Mount Horeb wasn't just a physical one. It was a journey of restoration. God was preparing Elijah for what lay ahead, a new chapter in his ministry. The silence of God, a still, small voice. When Elijah arrived at Mount Horeb, he took refuge in a cave, still hiding, still weary, still uncertain of his future. But then came the moment that would change everything. God spoke to Elijah, not through powerful wind, earthquake, or fire, like the dramatic displays of power Elijah had seen before, but through a still, small voice. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" 1 Kings 19 verse 9. God wasn't condemning Elijah for running away. He was inviting him to encounter his presence in a new way. Elijah, despite his fear and doubt, was still God's servant, and God still had a plan for him. The message was clear. In our moments of despair, God doesn't always reveal himself through grand, miraculous events. Sometimes, his presence is found in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the soul, when we least expect it. The call to continue. In the midst of his despair, Elijah encountered God's grace, and God gave him new instructions. He was to anoint new kings, and he was to appoint his successor Elisha, ensuring that God's work would continue long after Elijah's time. Elijah was not alone, and God had not abandoned him. The work was not over. And so, Elijah's story continues, no longer defined by his flight or despair, but by his renewed strength and the faithfulness of God, who never lets his servants falter for long. The God who meets us in our despair. What Elijah's flight teaches us is that God is near, even in our darkest moments. When we feel like running away, when the weight of life seems unbearable, when fear and despair threaten to consume us, we can remember that God is always there, waiting to meet us with love, grace, and comfort. Are you facing your own moments of exhaustion and fear? Are you tempted to give up? Elijah's story is a reminder that even in our weakest moments, God's compassion never fails. He provides strength for the journey ahead, and he will always be there to guide us back into his purpose. Elijah's flight wasn't the end of his story. It was a turning point, and for you, the same can be true. What comes next is nothing short of miraculous. Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb, a divine revelation. After fleeing in despair, Elijah's journey took him to the foot of Mount Horeb, the very mountain where Moses had once encountered God in the burning bush. But this wasn't just another geographical location. It was a place steeped in spiritual significance. Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, was where God had revealed himself to his people in powerful ways throughout history. Now, it would become the setting for a transformative encounter between God and his weary servant. As Elijah arrived at Horeb, he sought refuge in a cave, a place of solitude where he could rest and recover from the intense emotional and physical toll of his flight. It was here, in this moment of vulnerability, that God chose to meet him. But what would this encounter look like? After all, Elijah had already witnessed incredible displays of divine power, fire from heaven, the parting of the Red Sea, and the miraculous feeding by ravens. Yet God's next revelation would come in a way Elijah never expected. The voice of God in the quiet. Have you ever expected God to show up in dramatic ways, perhaps through a grand miracle or an overwhelming sign? We often envision God's presence as something forceful and awe-inspiring, like thunderclaps or a mighty wind. But as Elijah sat in the cave, waiting for God to reveal himself, he discovered something profound. God was not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. A mighty wind tore through the mountain, shaking its very foundations. But God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, the ground trembling violently beneath Elijah's feet, as if the very earth was about to split apart. Yet God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire erupted, consuming everything in its path. Yet still God was not in the fire. What was God trying to teach Elijah in this moment? What does it mean that God was not in these powerful, awe-inspiring events? It's as if God was showing Elijah, and us, that while he can work through the dramatic and extraordinary, his presence is not limited to grandiose displays of power. Sometimes, God's voice comes in the quiet, the stillness, and the most unexpected ways. And then, after the fire, came a gentle whisper. a voice, soft and soothing, like the stillness of a calm breeze. It was in this moment, in this subtle yet profound way, that God revealed himself to Elijah. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asked, not with condemnation, but with an invitation to deeper understanding. A moment of personal encounter. This moment of encounter wasn't just about God revealing himself to Elijah in a new way. It was also about God inviting Elijah into a personal conversation. In the silence of the whisper, Elijah had the opportunity to speak openly with God. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." 1 Kings 19 verse 14. Elijah's words reveal his deep despair and his sense of isolation. Despite the victories he had experienced, he felt utterly alone. But God listened. He didn't brush aside Elijah's feelings or tell him to just get over it. Instead, God patiently listened to Elijah's pain and gave him the space to express his doubts, fears, and frustrations. How often do we, like Elijah, find ourselves overwhelmed with feelings of loneliness, discouragement, or failure? Do we feel like no one understands our struggles, that God is distant or silent? Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb teaches us that God listens, not just to our praises, but also to our deepest cries. He doesn't reject our emotions or ignore our pain. He meets us in the quiet moments, in the places where we are most vulnerable. God's instructions for the next step. After Elijah shared his heart, God did not leave him there. He gave Elijah clear instructions for what to do next. God told Elijah to go back the way he came and anoint 3 individuals: Hazael, king over Aram; Jehu, king over Israel; and Elisha, who would become Elijah's successor. These were not just random tasks. They were divine appointments, part of God's plan to bring about judgment on Israel's enemies and to raise up a new generation of faithful leaders. God was reminding Elijah that the story was not over. Despite the setbacks, the fear, and the isolation, God still had a mission for him. Elijah was not alone. There were others who had not bowed to Baal, others who were still faithful to God. God revealed that there were still 7,000 in Israel who had remained true to him. 1 Kings 19 verse 18. Elijah was not the only one left. Call to faithful obedience. For Elijah, this encounter was transformative. The still, small voice of God reminded him that faith is not about being overwhelmed by the spectacular. It's about trusting in the quiet, trusting in the unseen. Sometimes, we search for God in the loudest, most dramatic events of our lives, but he may be waiting for us in the stillness, in the quiet moments when we are most open to hearing his voice. God's encounter with Elijah on Mount Horeb wasn't just about giving him direction. It was about restoring his purpose and renewing his strength. Elijah had felt like a failure, but God showed him that he still had work for him to do. And, importantly, God revealed that his presence was not bound by human expectations. He could speak powerfully in the silence just as he did in the storm. The quiet moments of divine revelation. We, too, are invited to listen for God's voice, not just in the noise of our busy lives, but in the quiet places of our hearts. When everything around us is chaotic, when we're overwhelmed by the challenges of life, God may be calling us to sit still, to listen to his gentle whisper. Have you ever felt like Elijah? Alone, lost, or ready to give up? Are you searching for God in the loudest moments, in the dramatic, when he might be speaking to you in the stillness? Mount Horeb teaches us that God is near, even in the most unexpected ways. He speaks to us in ways we might not understand, but in the quiet of our hearts, we can hear his voice if we're willing to listen. Just as God spoke to Elijah, he speaks to us. The question is, are we ready to hear? The transition to Elisha, a new chapter in the prophetic ministry. After Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb, it became clear that the time had come for the great prophet to pass on the mantle of his mission. Though Elijah had witnessed miracles beyond imagination and had stood as a powerful representative of God's authority, his journey was nearing its end. But God's work was far from over. And so, in one of the most significant moments in the history of Israel's prophetic ministry, Elijah would make a crucial decision that would set the stage for the next chapter in God's unfolding plan. the anointing of Elisha. The call of Elisha, a reluctant successor. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be called into something greater than yourself, to take on a responsibility so immense that it seems overwhelming? Imagine, for a moment, being Elisha, a man who was going about his day, working the fields, when suddenly the greatest prophet in Israel passes by and places a mantle upon his shoulders. Elisha was plowing the fields with 12 oxen when Elijah approached him, casting his mantle over him without a word. This simple yet profound act was more than just a gesture. It was an invitation. It was God's call for Elisha to leave everything behind and follow in the footsteps of the prophet Elijah. But how did Elisha respond to such a monumental calling? Without hesitation, Elisha ran after Elijah, saying, "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will come with you." 1 Kings 19 verse 20. This was not just a moment of personal attachment. It was a moment of understanding the gravity of the decision. Elisha wasn't merely saying goodbye to his family. He was leaving behind his livelihood, his identity as a farmer, and stepping into a role that would change his life forever. The symbolism of the mantle. Why did Elijah place his mantle on Elisha? The mantle was a symbol of prophetic authority, a sign that God had chosen Elisha to continue the work that Elijah had begun. In many ways, it represented the passing of the torch, a divine transfer of power and responsibility. In that moment, Elisha understood that his life was no longer his own. His calling was not just to be a successor to Elijah, but to be God's servant, to carry out a mission that would challenge him, transform him, and lead him to encounter both great triumphs and deep struggles. The mantle was not merely a cloak. It was a mark of divine purpose. But Elisha didn't just accept the mantle right away. He wanted to be sure of the decision. By asking for permission to say goodbye to his parents, Elisha wasn't questioning the calling. Rather, he was reflecting on the monumental nature of the choice he was about to make. In a way, it was his moment of deliberation, an acknowledgement of the sacrifice that lay ahead. And after kissing his parents goodbye, Elisha slaughtered the oxen, used the plow as firewood, and offered a sacrifice to God. This act symbolized his total commitment, a willingness to leave his past behind and fully embrace his new calling. A powerful partnership, Elijah and Elisha. Elijah and Elisha's relationship was not just that of a mentor and a disciple. It was a partnership forged through God's guidance and divine providence. As they traveled together, Elisha grew in faith, understanding, and strength. It was through their shared experiences that Elisha was molded into the prophet he would become. A prophet who would carry out even greater miracles than his predecessor. At one point, Elijah tested Elisha's resolve, asking him to stay behind in various cities, while Elijah continued his journey. But each time, Elisha refused, insisting, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." 2 Kings 2 verse 2. Elisha's determination and unwavering loyalty were clear. He was not just following Elijah out of duty. He was following because he understood the weight of his calling, the importance of the work, and the faithfulness of God who had called him. The miraculous double portion. As Elijah's time on earth neared its end, he and Elisha crossed the Jordan River together. And as they stood on the other side, Elijah asked Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha's response was nothing short of extraordinary. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." 2 Kings 2 verse 9. This was not just a request for power. It was a desire to continue the work Elijah had begun, to carry the mantle with even greater influence and effectiveness. Elijah replied, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." 2 Kings 2 verse 10. And then, in a moment of divine revelation, Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot of fire. Elisha, standing on the banks of the Jordan, witnessed this miraculous departure of his mentor. And in that moment, Elisha knew that God had granted him the double portion he had asked for. The mantle that Elijah had worn now fell to Elisha, a symbol of the new prophet's authority. He picked it up, struck the waters of the Jordan, and watched as they parted, just as they had when Elijah had done the same. It was in this moment that Elisha fully stepped into his calling. empowered by the spirit of Elijah and commissioned by God to continue the prophetic mission. A new era of prophetic power. Elisha's ministry marked the beginning of a new era in the history of Israel. He would go on to perform miracles that surpassed even those of Elijah. But it was not just the miracles that defined Elisha. It was his faith, his unwavering trust in God, and his willingness to follow wherever God led him. Elisha's call and the passing of the mantle teach us profound lessons about God's faithfulness in raising up new leaders, about the importance of mentorship, and about the courage required to follow God's calling. Elisha's story shows us that, just as God had been with Elijah, so too would he be with the next generation. And it is through these transitions, through the passing of the mantle, that God's work continues to unfold across generations, bringing his message to new hearts, in new places, and with new strength. Are you ready to take up the mantle God has prepared for you? To step into a calling greater than yourself? Elisha's story challenges us to be faithful, to trust God in every season, and to pass on the wisdom and faith we have received to those who will carry the torch forward. The mantle has been passed. Will you answer the call? The ascension of Elijah to heaven. A divine departure. The moment had finally arrived. The culmination of Elijah's earthly ministry was near. His prophetic work, full of miracles, divine interventions, and unwavering faith, had reached its apex. But what lay ahead for this mighty prophet? The Bible tells us that Elijah's departure was unlike any other in history. It wasn't a natural death, nor was it a quiet passing in the night. Elijah's ascension to heaven was a spectacular, awe-inspiring event, one that would forever mark his legacy. A divinely orchestrated farewell. Elijah's journey towards heaven began with a series of significant moments. Elijah and Elisha, now traveling together, came to a point where Elijah knew his time was drawing near. As they stood near the Jordan River, Elijah told Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." 2 Kings 2 verse 2. But Elisha, steadfast in his loyalty, refused to leave his master's side. He replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." 2 Kings 2 verse 2. This was not just a statement of devotion. It was a declaration of Elisha's readiness to carry on the work that Elijah had begun. And so, they continued their journey, moving from Bethel to Jericho, and then to the Jordan. With each step, the bond between the prophet and his successor grew stronger. But little did Elisha know, God had something far greater in store than he could imagine. The chariot of fire, a heavenly revelation. When they reached the banks of the Jordan River, Elijah took his cloak, struck the water, and the river parted before them. It was a powerful reminder of the miraculous acts Elijah had performed throughout his life, but it was also symbolic of what was about to unfold. After crossing the Jordan, Elijah turned to Elisha and asked him, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" 2 Kings 2 verse 9. In this pivotal moment, Elisha made a bold request. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, a request not for power, but for the ability to continue Elijah's prophetic work with greater authority and effectiveness. Elijah, moved by the request, replied, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." 2 Kings 2 verse 10. And with that, the moment of Elijah's ascension was set in motion. Suddenly, the sky was filled with an awe-inspiring spectacle. A whirlwind, a chariot of fire, and horses of fire appeared. Elijah's departure from the earth was nothing short of miraculous. The chariot of fire swept down and separated Elijah from Elisha, and before Elisha's eyes, Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. The sight was so extraordinary that it left Elisha in awe and amazement. As Elijah was taken up, he cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." 2 Kings 2 verse 12. Elisha's words reflected both his deep love and respect for Elijah, but also his recognition that Elijah had truly been a protector and champion for Israel. In that moment, Elisha saw the divine confirmation of Elijah's status as God's chosen prophet, the one who had led Israel with unwavering faith. A symbolic departure, What did it mean? What does the ascension of Elijah teach us? First, it shows that God's work is never limited to human understanding. Elijah's departure in a chariot of fire was a divine act, a symbolic and powerful reminder that God is sovereign over all things, even the moment of a prophet's death. This dramatic departure was not just for the benefit of Elijah, but for all of Israel to witness that God was actively involved in the lives of his prophets, and his mission would continue even after their earthly lives ended. This event also underscores the unique role of Elijah in Israel's history. He wasn't just any prophet. He was a prophet of extraordinary power, whose actions challenged kings, confronted false prophets, and called Israel to repentance. The way in which Elijah left this earth was a testament to the divine authority he had carried throughout his ministry. It was as if God himself was affirming that Elijah had completed the mission he had set for him. Elisha's moment of transformation. But Elijah's ascension wasn't just an ending. It was a new beginning. As Elijah was taken up, his mantle, the symbol of his prophetic authority, fell to the ground. Elisha, now left alone, picked up the mantle of his predecessor. It was in that moment that Elisha stepped fully into his role as the new prophet of Israel. With the mantle in his hands and the double portion of Elijah's spirit upon him, Elisha now had the authority and the power to continue the work that Elijah had started. Elisha didn't hesitate. He immediately went to the Jordan River, struck the water with Elijah's mantle, and, just as it had for Elijah, the river parted before him. The miracle was a clear sign to all that Elisha was now God's chosen prophet, equipped with the same power and authority as Elijah. A heavenly promise fulfilled. The ascension of Elijah is not just a spectacular event in the life of this prophet. It's a profound theological statement. It serves as a reminder that God's plans are always unfolding according to his divine will, even when it seems like a chapter is closing. Elijah's departure to heaven was not a tragic end but a glorious transition. It was a fulfillment of the promise that God would continue to raise up faithful servants to carry out his will. The ascension of Elijah also points forward to the future, a future in which all believers will one day be taken up to be with the Lord. Just as Elijah was caught up in a whirlwind, so too, those who are faithful to God will one day experience the divine rapture of being in his presence forever. Elijah's ascension reminds us that we are not alone in our journey, that God's work is always in motion, and that he is present with us, leading us to a future filled with hope and glory, a lasting legacy. Though Elijah was taken from the earth, his legacy lived on. It lived on in the prophetic mission of Elisha, in the hearts of the people of Israel, and in the pages of Scripture. Elijah's ascension didn't signify the end of his influence. It marked the continuation of God's work in the world. And so, as we reflect on this powerful moment, we are reminded that God's plans are always greater than our understanding. Elijah's story doesn't end with his ascension. It continues to inspire, challenge, and encourage us to live faithfully, just as Elijah did. The ascension of Elijah leaves us with one final question. What will we do with the mantle that God has placed before us? Will we pick it up, step into the calling, and continue the work God has entrusted to us? Or will we stand in awe, watching as the whirlwind takes the faithful into the heavens, wondering if we, too, will one day join them in the presence of our Creator? Themes and reflections. The profound lessons from Elijah's life. As we reflect on the extraordinary life of Elijah, we realize that his story is not just one of divine intervention, dramatic miracles, and powerful encounters with God. Elijah's journey offers deep spiritual lessons that resonate across centuries and speak to our own lives today. His life is a testament to faith, obedience, courage, and the enduring presence of God in times of challenge. Let's dive into some of the most profound themes and reflections that emerge from the life of this great prophet. Faith that defies all odds. One of the most striking aspects of Elijah's life is his unwavering faith in God. In times when Israel was steeped in idolatry, when the people had turned to the worship of Baal and other gods, Elijah stood firm. His faith wasn't passive. It was active, daring, and bold. He proclaimed the coming drought to King Ahab, knowing it would not be a popular message. He confronted hundreds of false prophets on Mount Carmel, knowing the risks but trusting in God's power to show his supremacy. Elijah's faith was tested time and again, and it was never found wanting. In the wilderness, when food was scarce and the future uncertain, God provided for him through the ravens at the brook of Cherith and later through the widow of Zarephath. These miracles weren't just displays of God's power. They were expressions of God's intimate care and provision for his faithful servant. The question that echoes from Elijah's story is this: do we have that kind of faith? Faith that stands strong even when everything around us is crumbling? Faith that trusts in God's provision when the future is unclear? Elijah's life challenges us to place our full trust in God's ability to provide and protect, no matter the circumstances. Obedience to God's calling. Elijah's obedience was another hallmark of his life. He didn't follow God because it was easy or comfortable. In fact, the path that God called him to was fraught with danger, isolation, and immense challenges. But despite these hardships, Elijah remained obedient to the calling God placed on his life. The moments when Elijah retreated into the wilderness, when he cried out to God in despair, and when he feared for his life, those were not signs of weakness, but of his deep struggle to remain faithful. His willingness to obey, even when he didn't understand or see the full picture, is something that should inspire all believers. How often do we hesitate or question God's calling in our lives? Elijah's obedience teaches us that we must trust God's plan even when it feels uncertain or difficult. God's calling is not always easy, but it is always worth it. The power of prayer and divine intervention. Throughout Elijah's life, prayer was a vital part of his relationship with God. His prayer for rain after 3 years of drought, his prayer on Mount Carmel for fire to descend from heaven, and his prayer for the revival of the widow's son. These moments show the deep connection Elijah had with God. They were not just isolated events. They were the result of a life lived in constant communion with the Lord. Prayer, for Elijah, wasn't a last resort. It was his first response. His ability to pray with boldness and confidence, knowing that God would answer, is a lesson in itself. God's intervention in Elijah's life was not coincidental. It was the result of his intimate relationship with the Creator. For us, this raises a powerful question. Do we approach God with the same boldness in prayer? Are we quick to pray when challenges arise, knowing that God hears us and is able to act on our behalf? Elijah's example invites us to trust in the power of prayer and to seek God's intervention in every area of our lives. God's presence in both the mighty and the quiet. Perhaps one of the most profound aspects of Elijah's story is his encounter with God at Mount Horeb. After his victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah fled into the wilderness, exhausted, frightened, and overwhelmed. He was running from Jezebel's wrath, convinced that his ministry had failed and that he was alone. But it was in his moment of despair that Elijah experienced one of the most powerful revelations of God's presence. As Elijah sought God in a cave, God didn't reveal himself in the earthquake, the fire, or the mighty wind. Instead, God spoke in a still small voice. 1 Kings 19 verse 12. This moment is a profound reminder that God is not always found in the dramatic or the extraordinary. Sometimes, God's presence is most profoundly experienced in the quiet, gentle moments of life. This teaches us something about how we approach God. Do we only seek God in the loud moments, in the moments of crisis, or do we also listen for Him in the stillness? Elijah's encounter reminds us that God's presence is not bound to any one form or time. He is there in the quiet as much as in the storm. We must learn to cultivate stillness in our lives to hear His voice. Legacy and continuity of God's work. The transition from Elijah to Elisha was another key theme in Elijah's story. As Elijah's earthly ministry came to an end, God raised up a successor in Elisha, ensuring that his work would continue. The mantle passed from Elijah to Elisha not just symbolized the passing of leadership, but it marked the ongoing work of God in the world. God's kingdom is never about a single person or moment. His work continues through generations, through His people, and through those He calls to carry His message forward. Even after Elijah was taken up to heaven, his legacy lived on in the miracles and ministry of Elisha. What legacy are we leaving behind? Are we faithfully passing on the baton to those who will carry God's work forward? Elijah's life teaches us that the work of God doesn't end with us. It continues through those who follow. Our lives are part of a larger story, one that God is writing through generations. The reality of spiritual battle. Elijah's life also reminds us of the reality of spiritual warfare. Throughout his ministry, Elijah faced powerful forces of evil. He confronted Ahab and Jezebel, the prophets of Baal, and the spiritual darkness that had overtaken Israel. His life was a battle between the forces of good and evil, light and darkness. But despite the overwhelming odds, Elijah remained victorious. Not through his own strength, but through the power of God. His story shows us that in our own lives, we too are engaged in a spiritual battle. And while we face challenges, the battle is not ours alone. God fights with us and for us, just as he fought for Elijah. Conclusion. A life of faithfulness and trust. The life of Elijah calls us to live with faith, obedience, and a deep reliance on God. His experiences, his prayers, his victories, his moments of doubt remind us that God is faithful, even when we are not. Elijah's journey invites us to live with the same boldness in our faith, the same commitment to God's calling, and the same trust in God's ability to sustain us through every storm. As we close the story of Elijah, we must ask ourselves, are we living a life that reflects the same devotion, courage, and faithfulness that Elijah exhibited? The lessons of Elijah are not confined to ancient times. They are alive today, calling us to be the kind of people who trust in God's power, live in obedience, and hear his voice in the stillness of our hearts.